Great, thank you very much. So welcome everybody. We're glad to see you back today. I'm just moving things around my screen so that I can see easily. Our CDE team is back with you today, and I will be co-facilitating this morning's webinar with my colleague, Jenny. We will be looking at the topic of assessment today, and so we'll be building on the model that we shared with you yesterday. In the preparation activity, in fact, before we met for yesterday's webinar, we had asked you to consider the larger context in which your course exists. And in yesterday's webinar, we introduced you to our course design model, the notion of alignment. So we hope that that was something that you retained, the importance of alignment, and a way to set up your learning aspirations for your students. So we had looked yesterday at some questions. We focused on outcomes. What will students know, value, and be able to do? Today, we're focused on assessment. How will you and students know the extent to which outcomes have been achieved? And then, of course, we will get later on to the strategies portion. That will be tomorrow. But today, we'll guide you through principles and practices of how to design quality assessment tasks so that you and your students will know the extent to which the learning outcomes have been achieved. And we're going to kick this off with one of my favorite strategies, and it is a picture prompt. So here we've got a question on the screen. What connections can you make between this picture and assessing students' learning? So it's a free association task. There's no right, there's no wrong. We're just asking you to think about, whatever comes to mind and put that in the chat. So what connections can you make between this picture and assessing students' learning? And I'm going to open up the chat so that I can see what you respond. Again, we have that awkward moment. People need thinking time. There we go. Multiple ways of seeing it, just like there are multiple ways of seeing this picture. Different ways, different students learn in different ways, diverse, Miro dancing in red and black, knowledge of contemporary painters. Connections and identifying relationships between concepts. There are more subtle assessment methods and more obvious ones. Just wait a minute to see if anything else comes up. Everything is connected. Multiple methods of assessments are needed to paint a whole picture. Ideas which are interesting but not well formed. Nice. Okay, so we've got a range of ideas there. Just before we go on, I'd like to say a word about this strategy. I said it's one of my favorites. This is a strategy that we're using here in the orienting and motivating section of the webinar to sort of stimulate your interest and prepare you for what's coming. But it's a strategy that can be used in different parts of your teaching. You can just pick any picture not related to your topic and use that to get students thinking. And it can be helpful for retention, because if students have to work hard to make these connections, there might be a better chance that they'll retain them. And with the idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words, the image then can just conjure up ideas for them. I'm just looking at what else came up in the chat. Okay, so I don't see that there's anything else there. All right, so with these many ideas in mind, oh, je vois un œil qui représente l'évaluation, une personne qui court qui représente une avancée. Yeah, okay, so another good idea. All right, so there are many things that are possible We're going to narrow our focus a little bit because we always want to have our outcomes. So we want outcomes even for today's webinar. Our learning outcomes for today's webinar are that by the end, we hope you will be able to describe purposes of assessment beyond grading. So we're going to look more closely at that in a minute, but grading is sort of an obvious purpose of assessment, but there are others. And the other outcome we have for today is that you will be able to apply learning-centered principles to your assessment plan. So with those two outcomes in mind, we are going to, I'm just going to change the slide here. We are going to start with an assertion. And this assertion is that assessment has a profound influence on learning and motivation. In the literature, this connection between the way we assess our students' learning and the way our students engage in learning is well-founded. From a practical point of view, this makes sense because, as some authors have pointed out, students can escape from our teaching, so they can choose not to come to class if they want to, and that's whether we like it or not, but they can't escape our assessments. They have to do the assessments in order to pass the course. So that's a good reason for us to be thinking about how we can make assessments valuable learning opportunities for our students. Now, what does that mean in terms of course design? It means that assessment is one of the first things to think about when designing a course. For some of you, that might be counterintuitive. A lot of us think, what's the content that I'm going to teach? And we might be thinking, how am I going to teach this content? So those are very typical ways to go about preparing for teaching or preparing a course, but we're asking you to put assessment at the fore and then ensure that your teaching is aligned with the assessment. So we don't want to wait until the end, toward the end of a course, to plan the assessment. Now, why do we assess students? And we're going to consider this question before we get to some principles of assessment. We can probably all agree that we assess students, we assess their work to judge or grade their performance at the end of a course or at the end of a unit. And we call that summative assessment. So it's at the end of the course. There are other reasons we assess students' work. And before I say any more, I'd like to give you an opportunity to do the thinking and put some ideas in the chat. Why else do we assess students' work? So we'll give you a minute to think and then to type. Yeah, to give them feedback. Imagine a quiz per course in order to prepare for the next class or to evaluate their actual level. Yeah, also good ideas. Make sure they understand concepts or not. See if we're on the right track. And then there was another one to determine their knowledge before starting the course. Sure, all good ideas. To get their attention. Nice, yeah. To drive their learning, make sure our content is well delivered. All good ideas. Help them recognize what areas they've understood less well or cannot apply. To determine if the learning outcomes are reached. Okay, so everybody's right on track there. Yeah, these are all good reasons for assessing students' work. And I've got them here on the slide, but these are things you have mentioned. So to provide ongoing feedback to students, to guide learning, and this could be graded or non-graded. So that's something to keep in mind. Formal or informal, and we call this formative assessment. So we had summative earlier when it's at the end of a course or a unit, but we have the ongoing feedback to students, and that's formative assessment. And then to motivate students, absolutely, assessment can motivate students. They see where they're at, and then they might be inspired to do more, do better. and inform actions that improve both teaching and learning. That's kind of like feedback for the instructor. And somebody did mention that in the chat as well. So if we see that all students in our class are struggling with some content, maybe that informs our teaching. Maybe we have to go back and reteach a concept before we can go on to something new, because we see that students are struggling, and we can see that through the assessment. So having this broader view of assessment can help us in terms of how we think about some of the principles to design effective assessment. And this is what we're going to be talking about now, the principles. We've got 4 principles. They are: align your assessment with learning outcomes. So that's something, of course, we did talk about yesterday. Allow your students to demonstrate the learning in a variety of ways. So we should be thinking about providing various opportunities for students to demonstrate what they've learned, rather than having one type of assessment. And the third one is to provide opportunities for practice and feedback. And I'm going to say it again, not all assessments need to be formally graded, and not all feedback needs to come from the instructor. Actually, I hadn't said that before. The graded part, yes, I had said that before. So not everything needs to be graded, and we will say more about that later on. And feedback can be from the instructor, but feedback can also come from peers, and there can also be some self-assessment. And then the 4th principle is be mindful of workload for you and your students. And this has proven to be particularly important in the online environment, which was new to many of us this past year. And in some cases, it was hard to gauge how much time assessments might take and how much time practice activities might take. So we get better at that with experience, but it's important to be attentive to workload, not just for your students, but for you as well. And assessing more is not necessarily assessing better. So we just want to keep that in mind, and balance the assessments with the time available, and with how to best assess the extent to which students have achieved the outcomes. So we're going to look at each principle in greater detail. And we have our first one, which is align your learning outcomes with your assessments. Students are naturally going to focus their attention on what you're going to assess. So we need to try to ensure that each assessment is an opportunity for students to demonstrate the learning specified in the learning outcomes. And we offer a question here for you. Is there a good fit between the learning outcomes you want your students to achieve and your assessment methods? And it becomes evident now why it's important to carefully craft those learning outcomes, because they can guide you in terms of the alignment, in terms of the type of learning that you want your students to demonstrate during the assessment. So this idea of alignment between learning outcomes and the assessment is really key in course design. And it works both ways. So as you start planning your assessments, you may find that you need to revise your learning outcomes. So remember, it's not a linear process. You might go back and forth between your learning outcomes and your assessments until you get it, I'm going to say right, but I mean, it's never really fixed. These things evolve over time. But the clearer your learning outcomes are, the more they can serve as a guideline for your assessments. And this approach makes your assessments intentional, and it can produce the type of learning you want your students to engage in, and it provides a way to communicate to your students the value of your assessment. It also affords transparency in terms of why you are asking students to do the particular assessment. And that can be motivating for students if they understand why they're doing what they're doing. I think that would work for all of us. Like, we might be more motivated to do things when we understand why we're asked to engage in a task. So now let's look at an example of alignment. And we're going to see how the principle of alignment can be applied. So we've got a learning outcome here on the screen. Students will be able to apply theoretical concepts to real-world problems. And the assessment is a take-home exam. Students are given 3 scenarios that illustrate current societal problems. They're asked to explain the scenarios through the lens of a theory discussed during the course. So now I'm going to ask you, in what way does this example illustrate the concept of alignment? So you can take a minute to think. If you are willing, please type in the chat how you see the concept of alignment illustrated in this example. I'm not seeing anything in the chat, and I hope it's not because nobody sees an example of alignment. Okay, so we've got, they're applying the learning directly. The assessment is an example, oops, it slipped here. The assessment is an example of the theory obtained in class, applying the theory to societal problems. 3 scenarios correspond to real world problems. Students need to apply the theory discussed in class. Yeah. Very similar terms occur in the learning outcome and the assessment, so it's easy to see how they relate. Okay, so again, yeah, everybody's on the right track. And we can see that there is a match. We see a match with some of the language for sure. But what students are being asked to do is really what the outcome says. So they're being asked to apply their knowledge, and by explaining the scenarios through the lens of theory discussed during the course, that is application of knowledge. So this is an example of a close correspondence between the outcome and the assessment, which is the take-home exam. I'm just going to see what else came up in the chat. And the outcome is to be able to apply theoretical concepts, and the assessment is asking to apply them. Yeah, scenarios represent the opportunity to apply theory. Okay, so you're all right on. Well done. So this is actually feedback for me and for the rest of the CDE team. You're following, and you seem to be understanding the concepts. So this is working well. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Jenny, who's going to take us through the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th principles.
Thank you, Carolyn. Good morning, everybody. So Carolyn, if you could please proceed to the next slide. The 2nd principle for designing learning-centered assessments is to allow students to demonstrate their learning in a variety of ways. And now, as Carolyn mentioned in the previous slide, looking at that alignment between learning outcomes and assessments, when we start with learning outcomes, rather than assuming a specific type of assessment at a starting point, it gives you some flexibility to choose the types of assessments that will best permit you to assess your learning outcomes. So you'll notice we didn't start off the Course Design Essentials webinar by saying, your class needs a midterm and a final exam. There may well be a midterm and a final exam. I have nothing against those, but it's important that it be an intentional choice that's informed by the learning outcomes themselves. When we think about assessment strategies for your courses, it can be helpful to have a range of assessment methods over the semester, and if feasible, to give students some choice in the assessment. That could be a choice about the topic, the task itself, or even the task weight, where possible, given your course context and workload. This can in turn encourage students to take greater ownership of their learning while still focusing on the intended course learning outcomes. As well, by considering what different assessment methods might help students demonstrate their learning, it can help to make assessment more inclusive and potentially more interesting for the students and for you too as you receive their assignments. We'd invite you to refer to the resources in myCourses aligned that are associated with the assessments module there for examples of a lot of different options for assessment to consider. You can move to the next slide, please, Carolyn. Great. This is continuing on that same idea. So principle number 2 of allowing students to demonstrate their learning in a variety of ways. We wanted to give you an opportunity for practice and feedback in applying these ideas. So the next animation on the slide that can come up is going to be a learning outcome that probably looks familiar to you because we saw it just a couple of slides ago. Students will be able to apply theoretical concepts to real-world problems. Now, we mentioned one possible assessment pairing that, Carolyn, if you want to click either, yeah, there we go, perfect, thank you, would be a take-home exam. This is just one possibility. There are many different options. So we wanted to invite you to think about what other options there might be of types of assessment that could help you to see whether students had achieved this learning outcome of applying theoretical concepts to real-world problems. If you could please share some ideas in the chat of other types of assessment that would help you to see whether students had that ability, that would be great. Final project, absolutely. In-class open book exam, nice. So thinking about not only what the assessment is, but where it takes place and what materials students might have access to, or books close. So we have some different options here for sure. Small group discussion and presentation of conclusions. Group discussion, links to read. Open discussion in which students are invited to think of current real-world problems and apply the learned concepts to explain and justify these events. Students working as teams to tackle specific problems and debates. Great, so feel free to keep those ideas coming because what's showing up through these different ideas is that there's so many different possibilities. We have one learning outcome, and depending on your course context, depending on how many students you have, what point it falls in the program and so on, and depending on how you want students to be relating both the material and to one another, these are definitely different approaches that they could consider. Group project, student presentations, or student teaching as well, right? So who are students demonstrating their knowledge to and how? Group report or manuscript. Great, thank you. You know, we have a few ideas as well that I'll just share on the slide, but what really strikes me is that you've spoken to a number of these already in terms of ways of students discussing with one another, whether that be in group discussions, debates, projects, this idea of, you know, whether things are happening in class or outside of class, whether it's a test or a written assignment. So we just wanted to sort of expand this idea of how students can demonstrate their learning in a variety of ways, because it can be easy sometimes to get locked into certain assumptions about what assessments have to be. So I so appreciate you sharing those wonderful different ideas about different ways that we can measure this learning outcome. So with that, one slide back, please. Thank you. We wanted to give you some time for individual reading. And I realize it might seem a little bit funny to give quiet time for individual reading during a webinar. We are doing this intentionally, have no fear. The reason we're doing it is because we are going to go into breakout rooms in a few minutes, and we want to give you time to, right before that, engage with some ideas, as well as to introduce you to a resource on the TLS website that may or may not be familiar to you. And since you've probably noticed already that we like to use guiding questions to help focus thinking and reading and speaking as well. So you'll see that we have two guiding questions here on the screen that we are going to ask you to keep in mind as you read some examples. And I'm going to ask Carolyn to toggle to the screen, toggle to the TLS website, and Rose to please add that link into the chat.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'd like to suggest that the questions also be added to the chat so that people don't lose sight of them.
Absolutely, thank you. So Rose, that's the questions that you actually would have had for slide 13. So if you can just move them up to right now, that would be wonderful in the chat, please. So Carolyn is now sharing a page of the TLS website that you'll be able to access with the link that Rose has included in the chat. And this page has example evaluation schemes for several different types of evaluations. And you'll see that for each type, They are linked to a learning outcome and to some tools. And as you click down the page there are 5 different tabs. So it gives you some ideas of across a number of different course contexts and aims, those learning outcomes, some things that we hope might be inspiring for you to consider for your own courses. So Rose has just put those guiding questions in the chat. Thank you so much. And I'll invite you now to take about 5 minutes to read through this information on the webpage individually with that link that's in the chat. You're welcome to turn your cameras off while you read if you like. And then I'll call you back in about 5 minutes. And at that point, we'll go into breakout rooms to discuss those questions. So I'll put 5 minutes on starting now. And if you'd like to pause the recording, that would be perfect. Thank you so much for taking some time to read those example evaluation schemes. And as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we'll be using these ideas as a jumping off point for the breakout room we'll be putting you in just a minute. So in your group, we'll ask you to discuss the 2 questions that are on the slide that you're seeing right now. Those are also included in the chat. Rose added those to the chat a few minutes back. And so the idea is that you'll be, again, in the same breakout rooms as yesterday. So you have the opportunity for continuity, making sort of some connections with colleagues who are also the same people who are in your groups in myCourses for the duration of the Course Design Essentials sessions. And so we'll invite you to engage around these questions. And we'll have about 8 to 10 minutes or so for the breakout rooms. So Rose, if you can please put people into breakout rooms. I understand that there might be a couple of manual adjustments, but if you can open that up when you have a moment, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm realizing that I called you back a couple of minutes earlier than we said we would. That's because a number of the groups were having some technical troubles, and we realized how frustrating that can be. We didn't want that to continue indefinitely. So we wanted to bring you back as a larger group. And we'll have just a couple of minutes for a slightly larger group discussion, thinking about those prompts. So if some of you were able to have conversations in your breakout rooms and you have something you'd like to share with the larger group, that would be wonderful. If somebody wasn't able to connect with their group mates but has some ideas about those questions, we very much welcome you to either share in the chat or to raise your virtual hand using that reactions button and then to share aloud. So Corinne.
Sorry, I got the reactions wrong the first time. At one point, the clapping's going to go. We weren't able to go through like everything, but overall, it was mentioned that the low-grade short quizzes were really good, especially with the idea that having more of the quizzes than what you would actually use really lowered the stakes for the students and made it less stressful. And the fact that they had to regularly just make sure that they were up to date or understanding things as they progressed. Like it removed a lot of the stress, and it meant that for their final assignment, whatever it may be, they would already have had to regularly keep working on things. So it felt as though that was definitely something that we could use and keep in our case.
That's good to hear. Thank you for sharing that. Other ideas?
I did. Oh,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So we didn't get the chance to have the discussion, but reading through the techniques, I really found interesting the blog idea, because I think it would it would be more fun also to write and to read when you're grading the assessment. And it gives the students an opportunity to kind of create new content in a more updated way, or even a vlog. I guess it would be a similar style of assessment. So that's something I never tried, and I would consider trying.
Thank you, Anna, for that. I think that Alexander might have had something, and then Naomi.
Yeah, I had something. It was maybe more of a question, which is, I assume there are some rules around, what can you set as an assessment for students? So, what kind of format can an assessment have in terms of, trying to do something different? So, are there like guidelines or like set rules about like what determines if something is accessible? Like, I imagine if you're having, say, students doing peer grading, you probably shouldn't use peer grades coming directly from peers as something that affects the student's actual grade. But is there somewhere that the sort of rules around that are laid out?
Good question. So McGill does have the university student assessment policy that does provide some guidance for what assessments can take place when, and some maximum pointage for certain types of assessments. That said, it might not have the answers to all your questions in terms of how many points should this assignment have, or is this an assignment that makes sense? So one of the things that instructors often have more flexibility in terms of developing assessments than we might expect, which can actually be really nice because it allows you to make sure that the assessment fits really tightly with your learning outcomes. We don't want every course to have the same learning outcomes. That wouldn't make sense. So we can ensure that with having a certain amount of flexibility, you can really tie quite tightly your assessment that makes the most sense for measuring those learning outcomes. And thank you, Carolyn, for putting the assessment policy in the chat there. That's something that we can certainly discuss further on in the connection opportunities this afternoon as well, in terms of seeing if you're considering new types of assessment policies, what might make sense, and getting a better understanding of that.
That's great, thanks.
Thank you. So Naomi, and then I think we'll move on.
Yeah, just a comment. I think this page is super helpful. So thank you for sharing it with us. What kind of struck me was how many tools are available in myCourses and that I didn't actually know about. So I think I agree with the comments about like the blog posts seem like a really interesting way, and this like tools like the peer reviewer, but also the team projects, the kind of ideas of, making that a team actually has to propose a plan. So they have to kind of work together to structure knowledge, right? And think about who takes the role in a kind of team project and how they present that, as well as the different tools for making videos, I think, and slideshow videos is really great to know. So
I'm so glad that you found that helpful. Thank you for sharing that. I see there's a question in the chat here. Is it the same policy for the School of Continuing Studies? So I appreciate that question coming up, because it is true that certain faculties faculties may well have faculty-specific policies. So I would encourage you to check with your faculty, with your director or program head, if there's something that will be informing you more locally that might not be widespread across the entire university. Okay, so moving right along, thank you so much for all those ideas and sharing some of the things that you found useful. And I apologize again for the little technological quirks. So we have next this third learning centered principle, providing opportunities for practice and feedback. And here again, we have a question: how can you best help students learn how to do well on your assessments? And what I'm really excited about is in the last few minutes, and certainly over the course of this webinar, you've described a number of ways that you can support students in your assessments. So I really appreciate your continued engagement. We're going to share a student's view on this question. So we're going to take a couple of minutes for a video, which is on the next slide.
The process of evaluation often is just a final exam, or potentially one assignment and then a final exam. So you're not really tested to as to the depth of your knowledge or your complete understanding of the material until that final exam. And so often you think you understand something, and then when you're confronted with a question or a certain scenario on the exam, and you think you've answered it, and you get your result back and you find out, okay, actually I missed this whole section, or I misunderstood. Those kinds of things I think can be disheartening for students, especially when that's the only means of evaluation. But sitting in here, and especially the way Professor Piper has used the room and set up all these exercises for us to do each class, it's like we're having mini exams all the time without the grade. So you're being forced to look at the problems, to analyze it, to work together, and to hear other opinions, so that I think what happens at the end of the day is you end up having a more complete understanding of the material than you would just on your own. And by having someone question you on what you're saying during the class or during the sessions, you are making sure that you yourself understand. So it's this idea of personal accountability for the material, which I think if everybody sort of takes it on board, it works really well.
We wanted to share this video because it can be really interesting to have a student perspective. And we promise that was not prompted, on this idea of ongoing feedback and how having opportunities for practice and feedback over the course of a term, as a number of you have spoken to, can be a really helpful way for students to determine their own ongoing understanding and to provide feedback to you as instructors as well. Now I realize that the student was talking about a physical learning environment, and that looking towards the fall semester, some of you might be in classrooms, some of you might be teaching online, some of you might be taking a blended approach. So certainly encouraging you to think about what practice and feedback can look like within the classroom environment that you will be looking towards for the upcoming semester. Now, some of the things I wanted to just raise from the students' reflections there are things that we've spoken to over the course of the webinar already, in terms of how ongoing feedback and opportunities for practice can help to guide learning, increase motivation, correct misconceptions early on, so it's not at the very last minute that you find out that something was unexpected, and develop those self-monitoring skills. And these are, of course, supported by the literature, and we have some references in the myCourses materials as well. This brings us to our last but not least, learning-centered principle, being mindful of workload. And I'm only going to speak to this very briefly, in part because we're running short on time, and in part because I think that the awareness of how heavy a light a workload can be has really hit home for us over the past year. We've heard from instructors and students alike that there have been some really intense times with the switch to remote learning. So I wanted to just thank you for all you put into your courses, for all the effort, for all that you've done to help these last couple of terms to be a success for yourselves and for students. And as we look forward to the fall, and recognizing that some things may change and some things may stay the same, really encouraging you to think about how your assessment plan is manageable for yourselves and your students in terms of how much you're assessing, how many assessments that involves, and when they take place. So Carolyn mentioned earlier this idea that quantity doesn't necessarily equal quality when it comes to assessments, that if we can have a certain number of assessments over the course of the term that give that ongoing practice and feedback, but that aren't overwhelming in terms of marking for you or in terms of feeling overburdened for the students, finding that good balance can be really helpful. And recognizing that not everything has to be marked. So thinking about how students practice and where the feedback comes from. It doesn't always have to be the instructor giving the feedback. It can come from self-assessment, through checklists, reflection, through peer assessment as well, which I think was Alexandra that mentioned that as an option. We have some resources on peer assessment that are also included on myCourses. In terms of making your assessment expectations explicit to your students, this is one of those things that can sort of feel like it goes without saying. You might think, well, they know what I mean when I talk about participation or when I talk about an essay. But since different disciplines and different course levels can address these things in quite different ways, it can be really helpful to explain exactly to students what you're looking for. And thinking about what has to happen for students to be able to succeed on an assessment, not only when it is due, but thinking about how much time you're expecting them to spend on it. especially if you're starting to have formative assessment. So assessment along the term, maybe something that hasn't been tried out in your course before. Thinking about whether what you're expecting students to put into it is what they're actually putting into it, or perhaps if it's a very lowly marked, a small mark, maybe students are actually putting more time into it than you would have expected. In that case, things like course workload estimators can be helpful to think about the time that would be required for a given assignment. And Rose has just shared them in the chat there. A last point I'll make in terms of assessment expectations is specific to technology, because part of what we're thinking about when we think about an assignment is what do students need to know or be able to do to complete the assignment. But there's also what do they need to understand in terms of the technology that might be required where appropriate. And it can be easy to assume that students have, they're tech savvy, so they should know this thing already. And it might not hurt to check in with students and see whether they truly do understand how to use the tools that will be required for a given assignment. So with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Carolyn as we come towards the end of the webinar.
Thank you, Jenny. So I'm going to assign a practice activity. We'd like to encourage you to continue filling in your course alignment plan. And if you go to myCourses, and you don't need to go there right now, you will see under the assessment module, we have exercise 3, and that is begin developing your assessment plan. So we have the instructions right here, and we're encouraging you to look at your learning outcomes, review them, make sure they reflect what you want students to learn by the end of the course, and then consider the assignments that can best measure that kind of learning. So here we have the course alignment plan, and this is the column that we're hoping you will fill in. In addition to this activity, which you can work on perhaps during the day, and then you can come to the connection opportunity and seek feedback if you like, but we do have another activity for you. This is in preparation for tomorrow's webinar. And if you go to the strategies module in myCourses, under informing, let me just click there. So under informing, we're going to ask you to view a short video. It's about 4 minutes, and look at a short reading. And we have the instructions right here. Watch the video, do the reading, and then we have a couple of questions for you to consider. You don't need to write down your answers for submission. We would like you to think and then come to tomorrow's webinar being ready to discuss these questions. So your thoughts about these questions. So we've got the reading circled right here. So you'll find all of that in myCourses. And we hope you'll be able to have the time to do that in preparation for tomorrow. So just as we wrap up here, we're always keen to know what your takeaways are. So if you could take a minute to type into the chat what those takeaways are, we'd appreciate it. We'd also like to remind you about today's connection opportunity. 2:30 this afternoon, 2:30 to 3:30. We had a very interesting discussion yesterday afternoon, and it seems people got some great ideas. So we hope you'll be able to join us again for that. And then, of course, once we do end today's webinar, please take the time to stretch. But if you do have a minute to let us know your takeaways, we would appreciate that. We will stay on for a few minutes. If anybody has questions, we'll do our best to answer. Okay, we've got things coming up in the chat. Alignment of outcomes with assessment methods. Assessments should align with the learning outcomes. And if you're wondering why I read these out loud, it's because we are recording the webinars. We will be posting the videos, and the chat does not appear in the video. So by saying these, by reading your contributions out loud, it's a way for those watching the video to know how the participation is playing out. And there are more ideas here. There are many options and a reasonable amount of instructor flexibility for assessment, emphasizing thinking about workload really hit home for me. Nice. There are several ways to assess the learning outcomes, and assessment do not have to be, so it's just be marked each time, and feedback can come from the professor, but also from peers. And different modalities for assessing the learning outcomes can provide feedback along many axes of different learning outcomes. So again, this is a way for us to get feedback on the effectiveness of our instruction during the webinar. We had a couple of outcomes at the beginning, and this gives us some information about the extent to which our learning outcomes have been achieved. So thank you all very much for participating. We hope to see you this afternoon, and I will stop sharing the screen in a minute. Remember that stretch. And if anybody has questions, we'd be happy to answer. And I think we can stop the recording now.